guys, welcome to week 46 in our reading. This week we've got a lot of good stuff coming out of Acts, some Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, a little bit of Corinthians. So I wanted to go into a couple of different things with us this week, and one of them is in Acts 15. A lot of times talking to people who are coming out from outside of the church and coming from our culture, when we start talking about different things like the Christian sexual ethic, they love to bring things up like, but you still eat shrimp. All of that stuff is in Leviticus. That's really outdated. And so, how is it that you can eat shrimp? You just pick and choose what you want from the law. And that's their essential argument. You pick and choose, therefore you have no right to say anything's wrong because you're already biased. So I wanted to take just a second to go into this and just look and say, as Christians, we actually do have a basis for our Old Testament hermeneutic, for what it is that we do and don't do with the law, for the parts of the law that we say, okay, these things apply to us, and then the other ones that we say that these are things that we can learn from really well and we can understand a principle, but it's not something that we have to practice. So we as Christians actually do have a solid hermeneutic for that. We're not just picking and choosing at random. So in Acts 15, you have this whole big controversy where the Jewish believers want the Gentile believers to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses. And so you have Peter and you have Paul, you have all these guys, they get together in Jerusalem and they have this council. And so what is the result of their council? Do Christians who are Gentiles have to follow the Jewish law? They do not. As a matter of fact, in this council, they specifically write to the churches and they say to the churches, okay, these are the things that you have to practice. You have to abstain from things polluted by idols, things strangled, blood, and sexual immorality. And so that's why we can say, okay, our hygiene and our food are different from what we saw in the Jewish culture in ancient times. But our sexual ethic has actually never changed. And so, that's what Paul is saying right there. And there are a couple of quibbles here because commentators, they suggest that the two dietary restrictions that we see here, which are things strangled and blood, that those things may still be enforced, at which point, as Christians, we have a duty to stop eating things like blood pudding or blood sausage, which I just think you shouldn't do anyway. And then we also have a duty to stop eating things like rare steak, which I love. And so, looking at that, we have to look at that honestly and really say, okay, is this something that we should be practicing? And why? Is this a testimony? How can we practice this as a testimony? So that's to stimulate your thinking. What I do think is going on here, and this is just me personally, the passage seems to indicate that part of the reason for prohibiting these things specifically is as a sensitivity to Jewish brothers and sisters who are very aware of Moses, because this is in Acts 15, 20, and 21. Verse 21, it says, "For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." And that immediately follows where you're supposed to abstain from things polluted by idols, sexual immorality, things strangled, and from blood. So I would suspect, potentially, because the New Testament really never expands on the things strangled and blood part, that may have more to do with a sensitivity to Jewish brothers and sisters. Whereas we do see a lot more expansion of the ideas of things that are polluted by idols and on things having to do with sexuality in the whole New Testament. And so I think that perhaps, and I could be wrong, one of them has to do more with sensitivity toward Jewish people, and then the other one has to do a lot more with this is the ethic that God expects from us everywhere at all times from all peoples. Again, I take that out of the context of the rest of the New Testament and places where the rest of the New Testament focuses on one thing and not another. But our sexual ethic has never actually changed. It's always been one man, one woman in marriage. And anything outside of that is considered fornication or adultery. All of that is considered wrong. And that's in the whole New Testament. That's in the Old Testament as well. And so that's God's basic standard. So I hope that helps. Hope that clears some things up. So when you do talk with someone and they say, but you just pick and choose, you guys still eat shrimp, that's violating Leviticus. And then you say that like homosexuality is wrong and that's violating Leviticus, but you violate Leviticus anyway. We actually do have a clearly defined sexual ethic in the New Testament and a clearly defined way of thinking about the Old Testament hygienic and social laws. And that's here in Acts 15. And so that we do have a basis for what we do, not just picking and choosing at random. Okay, Acts 16:3. Paul wanted to have him, Timothy, go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. Okay, previous chapter, you don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian. Acts 16, Paul takes Timothy out and has him circumcised. Why? What's going on? I think Paul has a very specific strategy as a Jewish man thinking about how to reach his own people and how to avoid giving needless offense to his own people. In other words, putting up a stumbling block or a barrier for the gospel that's not necessary. This is kind of like if you were to go to an Islamic culture and you were going to go and be a missionary in an Islamic culture, a very, very conservative culture, and you were going to go hang out in a bikini. That's going to put an unnecessary stumbling block into your gospel witness because none of the other women are doing that in a hardline culture. Or if you go and you're going to go to an Islamic culture, but you refuse to give up drinking alcohol, that's going to put an unnecessary just barrier in front of the gospel. So I think Paul is very, very intentional about when he does a thing like this and why. And I think specifically here it's because Timothy is half Jewish. Everybody knows his mom's a Jew and his dad's a Greek. So Timothy counts as Jewish, half Jewish. He's not been circumcised. And to the Jews, that would be extremely, extremely offensive. And it would also make it difficult for Paul to take Timothy with him into a synagogue or into the temple if something like that is to happen. So I think that's why Paul actually has this done. It's a matter of expediency and not of the law, and it's a way to remove unnecessary barriers to the gospel, because we later see that like with Titus or Luke or anybody else, he doesn't have them circumcised. He only does this with the half-Jewish Timothy. And so I think it's partially also that Timothy was already publicly identified as part Jewish, and so that's why there was this public knowledge, and so there needs to be kind of an action that makes it more public, that he actually has followed through with the law, and he's not offending his brothers and sisters who are Jewish. So hope that helps. Acts 16:10 says, "Now after he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them." So just want to draw your attention to this. This is the point in the narrative when Luke joins it. And so up until this point, it's been they, Paul, he did this, and now it's we. And so that's just kind of a neat moment just to notice. Now Luke's involved in the story. And then one last one, Acts 16:16-18. It says, "Now it happened, as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl possessed with a spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune-telling. This girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, 'These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation.' And this she did for many days. But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, 'I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her.' And he came out that very hour." Okay, what's going on here? I think that when we look at the New Testament, when we look at the teachings of Jesus and we look at the teachings of Paul and his approach to things, we see an awful lot of spiritual discernment. Neither one assumes that everybody that says, "Oh, this is Jesus, oh, you should follow him," is actually from Jesus. They are able and willing to recognize when there is a lying miracle, a lying sign or a wonder. And Jesus says earlier, he says, there are going to be a lot of false prophets and a lot of false Christs, and they're going to do signs and wonders and miracles to deceive, if possible, even the elect. And you shouldn't listen to them, and you shouldn't go with them. Now we see Paul actually following through with this, because here is this girl. She's possessed by a spirit. In Greek, it's a python spirit. This is what you see in the Old Testament when it talks about people who have familiar spirits or who are mediums. It's talking about people who have the same word, a snake spirit. And so here we have this girl. She's possessed by a python spirit. Everybody knows about it, that she goes and she gives these divinations and talks about the future. And so Paul, instead of saying, "Oh, great, it's another person who's talking about Jesus, that's just wonderful, I'm not going to think critically anymore," Paul says this person is possessed by a demon, and we don't need the testimony of demons about Christ. And so I just think as a church, we need to be discerning about just the way that we're accepting messages from different people. We need to be discerning in the sense of if it's not coming from the Bible, if it's not coming from someone who has made a genuine commitment to follow Jesus Christ as Lord. We may not need to listen to it, or we may not need to listen to everyone who does a sign or a wonder. Or if they do something genuine, even, it doesn't mean that it's from Jesus. And so we need to have a lot of discernment, and I think you see that in Jesus, and you see it in Paul. And there are people who are, these guys even say that there are people who will do miracles that are deceptive, that are designed to lead people away from Christ toward the miracle maker, even under the pretense of being from Christ. And so we need to have that kind of discernment and be able to say, okay, is this leading to Jesus, specifically to Jesus? Or is this leading away from Jesus? Is this leading to trust and faith in this person that is not Jesus? Um, and this may not apply to everybody in our culture. We're a very secular, materialistic culture, and so we don't see a lot of that or admit to a lot of that. But I worked in different cultures, and I think it's very true. There are people that claim to have done miracles, that they bleed from their hands and feet, they show the marks of the stigmata, but they're not drawing people to Christ. They're drawing people to themselves. Or people that claim to be prophets, and they'll tell you what is the future of your life and everything that you need to do, and they're looking for somebody to follow them and not Jesus. And so we just need to be really, really discerning and help our brothers and sisters also to be very discerning. So I hope that helps. Have a great week.